Some of the research presented in the chapter talked about how adults improve their VO2 by training at least 3 times a week for at least 20-minute sessions at an intensity of 60 to 90% of their maximum heart rate. So this is all the way up into older adulthood. It could be beneficial for them to just take a brisk walk around the block. Knowing the progression of locomotor skills in older adults, they take shorter steps. So going around the block might take 20 minutes. And it might be enough to get their heart rate to 60 to 90% of what their max heart rate would be, which is significantly lower than that for any of us. Average max oxygen uptake per kilogram of body weight peaks in the 20s and then decreases about 1% per year throughout your adult years, regardless of the activity level. So the more trained you are, kind of by the time you get to your 20s, the better off you are in this area. Overall peak VO2 is higher in trained people, again, versus physically active people versus sedentary people. So now that kind of like brings us to cardiovascular structure and function and how that might change with aging. So the structural changes, remember, structure is related to function. So typically in anatomy, we learn structure. In physiology, we learn function. Put those two together, and you have a human body. Typically what we see, though, with aging is we see a loss of cardiac muscle, decreased elasticity, meaning that elasticity is directly related to the filling capacity, right? The more that the walls of the heart can stretch, the more blood that we can fill in the ventricles, which means the more blood we can pump out into the body. So decreased elasticity is going to have a direct effect on how much blood, therefore how much oxygen we can pump into the body at one time. Oftentimes there's a thickening of the left ventricular wall, which is going to contribute to its stiffness. And the left ventricle, if you guys remember, blood pumps from our systemic system into our right side of our heart, goes to the lungs, goes through our pulmonary, respiratory, or pulmonary flow to get oxygenated, which is then pumped into our left side of our hearts, or the left chamber of our hearts, to get pumped to the rest of the body. So stiffening of that ventricular wall is going to directly affect the contractile properties and how much force we're able to produce in that left ventricle to pump blood to the rest of the body. We also have fibrotic changes in the valves, so there might be issues with closings of the valves, which can lead to different heart conditions. Major blood vessels thicken and stiffen, so they're less compliant to changes in blood pressure. But all of these structural changes can lead to functional changes. Maximum heart rate decreases gradually with age. We can simply figure this out with the 220 minus your age. So the older you are, the more you're subtracting from 220, which means the smaller your max heart rate's going to be. Stroke volume may or may not decrease. Usually decreases are prompted by some underlying cause, such as like an asymptomatic heart problem or disease. But generally, the stroke volume should stay constant for the most part. Cardiac output should be unchanged when at rest or at submaximum effort, primarily because stroke volume is generally unchanging, but it's going to decrease with heavy activity because remember, cardiac output more immediately changes as a result of heart rate, and if your maximum heart rate is decreased, your cardiac output is thereby limited by that lower maximum heart rate. But adults who train or who engage in a lot of training can kind of delay this decrease, or they can delay the decrease with in their peak VO2. Blood pressure increases at rest as well as during activity. And this is, again, directly kind of relating to the blood vessels thickening and stiffening. Okay, so if they're less compliant, that means they're less flexible to change with pressure. So you can think about it in terms of filling a water balloon with water versus filling a cup with water. The balloon material is compliant to how much water you can fill. Thus, you could probably fill a higher volume of water in a water balloon than you would if you were confined to a stiffened structure of like a glass or plastic cup, right? So if we think about that volume in terms of like our blood vessels and how much pressure each of those vessels can sustain, if they're thicker and stiffer, they're going to be less adaptive to pressure changes, or less adaptive to volume changes, which means that pressure is going to increase in the vessels. So blood pressure generally is going to increase as a result of that. But blood pressure could also be dependent on the health of the cardiac muscle fibers and their ability to operate under an increased workload. So again, training and physical activity generally are associated with lower blood pressure and can kind of help decrease the rate that aging might have its negative effects on aerobic development or aerobic capacity. And then the last thing we have is blood flow and hemoglobin content. Generally, those are pretty well maintained, but the chances of becoming anemic are increased. Usually that's associated with either decreased red blood cells or decreased hemoglobin with optimal functioning. So either you just lose your red blood cells or your hemoglobin just doesn't work. But otherwise, generally blood flow and hemoglobin content are pretty constant. We also know that cardiovascular structure and function is not the only thing that plays a role in aerobic capacity, but respiratory structure and function are also important because that's how we oxygenate the blood that gets pumped through the body. So with aging, usually we have a decreased elasticity in the lung tissue, meaning they will expand less, which means less oxygen comes in. We know at the level of the alveoli, which have a bunch of this huge capillary network where we're allowing this transfer of oxygen to happen from the lung tissue to the blood, which goes back to the heart. If we can't expand our lungs as much, we can't get this oxygen to these deeper alveolar tissues, which means we're getting less oxygen into the blood. So in terms of functional changes, this means we have a decreased vital capacity, which is decreasing at about 4 to 5% per decade starting during the 40s. Vital capacity is how much air you can get in, I believe, with a maximal inhalation plus a maximal exhalation. I think it's measured in volume. I think that's what it is. There's respiratory charts that you guys can look at, and there's a ton of different variables and measurements that can be made off of those, so sometimes it can be confusing, but vital capacity generally decreases. That's what you need to know. And then they usually have a decreased efficiency of gas exchange, which is what I was just mentioning. If you can't expand your lungs as far, not as much oxygen comes in, less O2 availability to attach onto our blood, less oxygen is then therefore being delivered to the tissues. So all in all, respiratory and cardiovascular systems are going to be working very closely together in terms of how we can track developmental changes as we go through adulthood. And then again, our changes in muscle mass are going to have an impact. So decreased muscle mass with age, we know that. With less muscle mass, we have less substrate availability because muscle stores different metabolic or metabolites for our oxidative processes, so we're going to have a decreased peak VO2. We also know, as we talked about in the last lecture, that we get increased adipose tissue with age, which is going to work against the maintenance of peak VO2. Physical adaptations, usually we have decreased max exercise capacity, decreased peak VO2, increased recovery period, so this just means we can't exercise as long because we can't utilize as much oxygen, which means we're going to fatigue faster, and probably the fatigue is going to have a bigger effect on us than it would in younger adulthood, which means our recovery period is longer. Other environmental factors that play a large role in the maintenance of aerobic development have negative effects, at least, have been smoking or poor nutrition. Positive effects are from good diet and physical activity. So just stay physically active and you can kind of reverse the effects of aging, pretty much is what this means. In terms of training programs in adulthood, generally the decline in peak VO2 is regardless of training, being physically active or sedentary. So in this graph over here, we can see age kind of grouped by decades, and then VO2 max on the y-axis. We can see trained athletes, active people versus sedentary people with training versus sedentary people alone. And the decrease or the decline is inevitable in each group as age progresses. But with the sedentary people, it is important to note that if you train them or if you increase their physical activity, that their VO2 max can still improve. So that's not to say that if you're already super active and you increase training even more, that you're going to have an increased peak VO2, but it's definitely, this decline is less dramatic in people who are trained. So again, physical activity could save your life. Adaptations to training, generally it's going to lead to maintenance or improvement of muscle mass, which we know is directly attached to our peak aerobic capacity. We'll have a larger vital capacity, meaning if we're working our lungs and we're stressing them in decent ways, that we're going to be able to keep the same expansion rate, and we'll have a healthier, well-developed cardiovascular system. So typically it's suggested that people who have heart disease or who are prone to heart disease should participate in moderate intensity exercise, just because it helps with their heart health. Okay. And this is the point where I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago, there was a case study done on this guy called Clarence DeMar. He ran 12 miles every single day throughout his entire life. I think it was notated that he didn't even take breaks on holidays. He died at the age of 70 of cancer, which is kind of unfortunate, but he had donated his body to science, and they did an autopsy after his death. It showed that his cardiac muscle stayed intact. All the valves were normal. Coronary arteries were 2 to 3 times bigger than his same age counterparts. So, I mean, running 12 miles every day is kind of excessive, but it goes to show that physical activity can promote heart health. So, do it for yourselves, you guys. All right, long-term effects of training in terms of both power and endurance is kind of limited research at this point. We might see more research coming out. I feel like long-term effects, usually you have to, it might be harder to implement in terms of study design, just because the best tracking would be with a longitudinal design. You have the same people over many, many years, but also you would have to control their lifestyles. I don't know how many people would be game for signing up for that. But generally, an active lifestyle and our participation in aerobic training during childhood and adolescence can predispose people to be more active in adulthood. It's kind of the same thing that we looked at in terms of childhood obesity, right? If you're less active, more obese in childhood, you're likely to be less active or more obese in adulthood. So physical activity kind of goes hand in hand with that. At any age, current activity level is the most important factor to aerobic fitness, though. So, although training has mixed effects in childhood or later or earlier in the lifespan, it definitely has very clear effects in young adulthood into mid-adulthood into older adulthood. So, again, physical activity, you guys.